Middle Ages Power Shift, Unit 4. By the end of this video, you should be able to describe how the power structure at the end of the Middle Ages was different from the beginning of the time period. Identify key leaders and give examples of how the powers of the government changed under their rule. Explain why there was a power struggle between the church and state or secular government, and identify two events that marked the end of the Middle Ages. Changes in the power structure. The beginning of the Middle Ages was characterized by local control and feudalism, or the relationship between the lord and his vassals. By the end of the Middle Ages, this relationship had broken down, and instead the Middle Ages were characterized by increasing power and influence of a national or centralized government. In a lot of cases, this is going to be a king who has more power. Let's look at some examples in England through the time period. The population of England was a combination of groups known as the Angles, the Saxons, and different Germanic tribes. William the Conqueror led the Norman conquest of England, including the Battle of Hastings in 1066. Under William's rule, the Normans intermarried with the Anglo-Saxons to form the basis of what we know today as English culture. His leadership led to some changes. First of all, he adopted the Anglo-Saxon use of a sheriff as a local leader, and that's a tradition that we have even today. He administered the first census or count of the people that had been taken since Roman times, and it's recorded in a document called the Domesday Book. And he developed a tax system and royal courts. So he's consolidating his power as a national ruler. Fast forward about 100 years, and you get Henry II, who is of the Plantagenet dynasty that ruled England from about 1150 to around 1485. He increased the power of the king or the monarch. He increased the number of criminal cases that would be tried in his court instead of local courts. And specifically, he shifted property cases, property disputes, from local courts to royal courts so that he had more knowledge and authority of what was going on. He also developed the idea of common law across England, and it means exactly what it says, that the law is common, it's the same for people wherever they live. And he replaced local laws and customs with this idea of common law, that everybody follows the same rules. He was also engaged in a power struggle with church officials, and at one point he really just went off on a rant against the Archbishop of Canterbury. And in response to things that he said, one of his people actually murdered the Archbishop, whose name was Thomas à Becket. King John is Henry II's son and is generally not considered to be a very good king. The nobles were upset by the growing power and influence of the monarch, a lot of which had happened under King John's father, Henry II. And the situation deteriorated to the point that King John was forced to sign the Magna Carta, which literally means Great Charter. And it recognized the legal rights of vassals in relation to the king. It limited what the king could do, and it stated that the nobles, the vassals, had certain power and authority that hadn't previously been recognized. Edward I is the king when the idea of the Magna Carta and the limited power of the king, it goes a step further, and the English Parliament is created, and it works like a representative government that has the power to grant taxes and pass laws. So two groups were formed to represent the views and ideas of the people in England. The House of Commons was made up of 2 knights from every county and 2 people from every town. So they represented the more average people in England. And then all the nobles and bishops throughout England were given seats in the House of Lords. And that's actually the basis of the English Parliament today. They still have a House of Commons and House of Lords, and this is where that idea originates. Now, in France, even though it was ruled by kings, the dukes or the nobles had as much or more power as the kings did. We'll look at two kings in particular. King Philip II Augustus went to war with England to gain territory, and at the same time, he's increasing the income and power for France. And then Philip IV created French Parliament, which is called the Estates General. And he also has representatives from each of the classes or estates in France. The clergy represented the first estate, the nobles represented the second estate, and the townspeople and peasants were represented by the third estate. So you can see that just like in England, the king is trying to sort of consolidate power away from local areas and have it more centralized. There's also a power struggle going on between the church and state, or the secular government led by the king. Some favored the church having more power, others favored the state having more power. In central Italy, there was some territory that was under the direct control of the church, and that's the Papal States. And even today, there's a small area in Italy that is directly under the governance and authority of the Roman Catholic Church, and it's the Vatican City. Now, the Pope often acted as though he was the supreme ruler in Europe, even though he really wasn't a political leader most of the time. But the church leaders, including the Pope, would use certain powers to try and control what the kings, the secular leaders, were doing. One example of this is interdict, and that's when the Pope said that a group of people were forbidden from taking their sacraments. Well, that upset people because they felt like that was interfering with their relationship with God and their access to salvation. So they would then pressure the king to do whatever the Pope was asking him to do or not do, so that the interdict would be removed and they could start taking sacraments again. The Inquisition was a court that was set up by the Catholic Church to find and punish heretics, who are people who go against official church doctrine. And again, this is really the church trying to exercise its control over the people and the governments and how they live. By the end of the Middle Ages, there are really two main events that kind of mark the end of this time period. Number one is the event known as the Black Death, and it's an outbreak of the plague. It spread along trade routes across Europe. Population in cities and towns were devastated. Historians estimate that as many as 1 in 2 people died in certain locations. It had an economic impact. Trade decreased and wages increased because there was a labor shortage. Literally, so many people died that there weren't enough workers, and so what you had to pay workers increased. But prices dropped because demand dropped. There just weren't as many people to buy things. It also had a religious impact because people didn't understand how the disease was spread. They thought that it might be the result of sin, or it might be the work of certain groups that were outside the Catholic Church. And the power of the church declined because people would pray for relief from this outbreak and it didn't come. And so they wondered why the church wasn't able to meet their needs. There's also the legacy of an event we've already talked about, the 100 Years' War between England and France. And it definitely leaves England and France and even other countries like Spain with a focus on the power of the monarch and the importance of a strong government. Because if war was going to continue, then your country needed to be organized around a king who was a good leader. This is the end of the videos on the Middle Ages. Thanks for watching.